Why Arthas became the Lich King, the tragedy of Warcraft's greatest villain. Every great fantasy world has its legendary hero. The warrior who saves the kingdom. The champion who defeats evil. The king who protects his people. But every once in a while, a story asks a far more interesting question. What happens when the hero becomes the villain? In the history of Warcraft, no character represents that question better than Arthas Menethil. Years after his story first unfolded, players still debate the choices he made. Some believe he was a monster long before he claimed Frostmourne. Others argue that he was a good man pushed into impossible situations. And that's exactly why his story has endured for decades. This isn't simply the tale of a prince who fell from grace. It's a story about fear, responsibility, obsession, and how even the noblest intentions can slowly transform into something unrecognizable. What makes Arthas fascinating isn't that he became the Lich King. It's why he became the Lich King. Unlike many fantasy villains who seek power for selfish reasons, Arthas begins as someone driven by duty. He wants to protect his people, defend his homeland, and stop a threat that seems impossible to contain. Those goals are understandable, even admirable. The tragedy lies in the fact that every decision he makes feels reasonable in the moment. Each compromise seems temporary. Each sacrifice feels necessary. Each line he crosses appears justified by the danger standing in front of him. Looking back, it's easy to point to the final outcome and say he should have chosen differently. But stories like Arthas's remind us that corruption rarely arrives all at once. It happens gradually, one decision at a time, until the person making those choices can no longer recognize how far they've drifted from who they once were. That's what elevates Arthas beyond a memorable video game antagonist. He's a warning, a reminder that determination without restraint can become obsession, that responsibility without wisdom can become tyranny, and that the desire to save everything can ultimately destroy the very things we love most. In this documentary, we're not simply revisiting one of Warcraft's most famous characters. We're exploring why his downfall still resonates with millions of players, what makes his journey one of gaming's greatest tragedies, and why, even after all these years, the story of Arthas Menethil continues to define what it means to create a truly unforgettable villain. The weight of a crown. Leadership is often romanticized in fantasy. Kings inspire armies. Princes ride into battle. Heroes make impossible decisions, and somehow everything works out in the end. But Warcraft presents something much more believable. Real leadership isn't about glory. It's about carrying the weight of thousands of lives, knowing that every decision will help some people while hurting others. Arthas grows up knowing that one day he will inherit that responsibility. He's expected to become more than just a skilled warrior. He's expected to become the protector of an entire kingdom. That expectation shapes nearly every choice he makes. From the outside, it's easy to judge his actions. We already know how the story ends. But imagine standing in his place, watching an enemy spread faster than anyone understands, while every hour of hesitation means more innocent people are lost. Would you wait, or would you act? That question sits at the heart of Arthas's tragedy. Throughout Warcraft, many characters face impossible situations. Some choose patience. Others trust their allies. Some simply accept that not every battle can be won. Arthas is different. Failure isn't something he believes he can allow. To him, losing doesn't just mean defeat on the battlefield. It means families destroyed, cities abandoned, an entire kingdom falling because he wasn't strong enough to stop it. That mindset is what makes him both heroic and dangerous. Because when someone believes failure is unacceptable, every sacrifice starts to feel justified. One difficult decision becomes two become 10, and before long, the person who once wanted to save everyone begins convincing himself that any cost is acceptable if it leads to victory. History, both real and fictional, is filled with leaders who started with noble intentions but slowly convinced themselves that the end justified the means. That's why Arthas feels so believable. He's not driven by greed. He's not searching for riches. He doesn't begin his journey dreaming of conquest. He simply refuses to lose. And sometimes, that can be the most dangerous motivation of all. The psychology of obsession. There's an important difference between determination and obsession. Determination pushes you to overcome obstacles. Obsession convinces you that nothing else matters. At first glance, those two ideas can look almost identical. Both demand commitment. Both require sacrifice. Both involve taking risks that others would avoid. The difference is where they eventually lead. A determined person still knows when to stop. An obsessed person forgets why they started. As pressure continues to build, Arthas gradually stops asking whether his choices are right. Instead, he begins asking a different question. Will this help me win? That shift changes everything. When success becomes the only measure of morality, every boundary begins to disappear. Friends become obstacles. Advice becomes interference. Doubt becomes weakness. One of the reasons players still discuss Arthas decades later is because this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually. Every new decision feels like a continuation of the previous one. Every compromise feels only slightly more extreme than the last. That's exactly how real obsession works. People rarely wake up as villains. They become them through countless small choices, each one easier to justify than the last. Warcraft uses Arthas to explore a timeless truth. Power doesn't always corrupt someone immediately. Sometimes it simply magnifies the parts of them that were already there. His courage becomes recklessness. His determination becomes obsession. His sense of duty becomes absolute control. Those qualities once made him a promising leader. Without balance, they become the very traits that lead to his downfall. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of his story. The strengths that could have made him one of Azeroth's greatest kings are the same strengths that ultimately transform him into one of its most feared rulers. Frostmourne, more than just a legendary sword. Every great fantasy world has a weapon that becomes larger than life. In The Lord of the Rings, it's the One Ring. In Arthurian legend, it's Excalibur. In Warcraft, it's Frostmourne. But what makes Frostmourne so memorable isn't its incredible power. It's what it represents. On the surface, it's a weapon capable of turning the tide of a seemingly unwinnable conflict. To any warrior facing overwhelming odds, that kind of power is almost impossible to ignore. And that's exactly why it works so well as a symbol. Frostmourne isn't simply about strength. It's about temptation. It asks a question that has appeared in myths and stories for centuries. How much of yourself would you give up if it meant saving everyone else? Most people would like to believe they'd never make that bargain. But history and fiction suggest otherwise. When fear is at its highest, when the pressure is unbearable, and when every choice seems to end in disaster, the promise of an easy solution becomes incredibly difficult to resist. That's what gives Frostmourne its lasting impact. It isn't just a magical artifact. It's the physical embodiment of a dangerous idea that power can solve every problem. Warcraft doesn't present power as inherently evil. Throughout Azeroth, countless heroes wield incredible strength without losing themselves. The difference lies in why that power is sought. Is it earned through patience, discipline, and trust? Or is it pursued out of desperation? That distinction changes everything. Because desperation has a way of narrowing our vision. It convinces us that there is only one path forward, only one choice, only one answer. And when someone reaches that point, they often stop questioning the consequences. The goal becomes so important that everything else fades into the background. That's why Frostmourne continues to resonate with players decades later. It isn't remembered because of the battles fought with it. It's remembered because it forces us to confront a timeless truth. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the enemy standing in front of us. It's the belief that unlimited power will finally make us safe. Why players still connect with Arthas? Video game villains come and go. Every expansion introduces a new threat, a new enemy, a new world-ending crisis. Yet few characters remain as deeply rooted in the community's memory as Arthas. Why? Part of the answer is simple. He's relatable. Not because players agree with every decision he makes, but because they understand the emotions driving those decisions. Fear, responsibility, pride, the desperate need to protect the people who matter most. Those emotions are universal. Most players have never led a kingdom or faced supernatural horrors, but nearly everyone has experienced moments where they felt responsible for others, afraid of failing, or convinced they had to carry every burden alone. That's what gives the character such lasting emotional weight. His story isn't just about fantasy kingdoms or magical weapons. It's about the danger of believing that you alone can fix everything. In many ways, Arthas reflects a flaw that exists far beyond Warcraft. The belief that asking for help is weakness, that slowing down means failure, that the weight of the world has to rest on one person's shoulders. It's a mindset that can consume anyone. And perhaps that's the greatest reason his story continues to be discussed all these years later. Not because he became one of gaming's greatest villains, but because, underneath the armor and the legend, players can still recognize the human being who made one terrible decision after another, always believing he was doing the right thing. Why tragic villains stay with us? Think about the greatest villains in fiction. Darth Vader, Magneto, Walter White, Thanos. None of them are remembered simply because they were powerful. They're remembered because we understand them. We may not agree with their decisions, but we understand the fears, hopes, or beliefs that push them toward those choices. That's what separates an unforgettable villain from a forgettable one. Pure evil is intimidating. A tragic villain is fascinating. Arthas belongs firmly in that second category. Players don't spend years debating his story because they're trying to excuse what he became. They debate it because his journey raises uncomfortable questions. Could things have ended differently? At what point was there no turning back? And perhaps the hardest question of all, would someone else have made the same choices under the same pressure? Those are questions without easy answers, and that's exactly why the character continues to spark conversations decades after his debut. Blizzard's greatest storytelling achievement. World of Warcraft has introduced hundreds of memorable characters. Some are heroes, some are villains, some appear for a single expansion before fading into the background. Yet very few have achieved the same lasting legacy as Arthas. Part of that success comes from patience. His story wasn't built overnight. Players watched it unfold over years, across multiple games and expansions, allowing them to form an emotional connection long before he became one of gaming's most recognizable antagonists. Another reason is consistency. His motivations always felt grounded. Whether players agreed with his choices or not, they could follow the logic behind them. That's an incredibly difficult balance for writers to achieve. Many fictional villains suddenly become evil because the story demands it. Arthas feels different. His transformation feels like the result of accumulated decisions rather than a single dramatic twist. And because of that, his story feels believable within Warcraft's world. The legacy of the Lich King. Even years after Wrath of the Lich King, Arthas remains one of the first names that comes to mind whenever players discuss Warcraft. New expansions have introduced larger threats. Ancient gods, cosmic forces, entire new realms beyond Azeroth. Yet many fans still compare every major villain to the Lich King. That says a lot about the impact of his character. It's not just nostalgia. It's the standard he set. He became the benchmark for what players expect from a Warcraft antagonist. Someone with depth,